Good morning. We look today at Acts chapter 17, and Paul and Silas continue traveling around, and it tells us that Paul and Silas had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, or whatever, and they came to Thessalonica. And Thessalonica is a Jewish community that Paul wrote two letters. We have the first and second Thessalonians, letters that Paul wrote later on to encourage the believers in this city, to correct them, or to, but we have two letters that Paul wrote to these people later on. So they became people who were dear to his heart, that he knew were believers in Jesus. And at Thessalonica, it says there was a synagogue to the Jews, and there weren't Jewish synagogues in every city, but there were Jewish contingencies in a lot of cities, and a lot of the major cities did have Jewish synagogues. And we'll find that out as we read through chapter 17, that there were Jewish synagogues in several more cities. But Luke tells us that, as was Paul's custom, he went to the synagogue for 3 Sabbaths in a row, and it says he argued with the Jewish leaders there about the scripture. And I've written in my margin, debated with them or reasoned with them, argued with them. I mean, sometimes when we hear the word argument, it sounds like, just you're going at each other opposite sides and everything. But I mean, we argue in the court of law, that way too. But we debate, we present the facts that we believe, that we want others to hear. So he was arguing or debating or reasoning with them, explaining to them from the scripture the prophecies of Jesus, and how Jesus, the Messiah, must suffer, he must die, and he would be resurrected, and then proclaiming this Jesus as the Messiah. So he was showing these Jewish people from scripture that Jesus is the Messiah. And there were many of the Jews there that believed and accepted, along with some of the Greek men and some of the Greek women who believed in God rather than the Greek gods or whatever. But there were other Jews that became upset. Jealous is the word that Luke uses. And then it says, with the help of some ruffians in the marketplace, they formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. Does that sound familiar with what's happened? No, well, not in the last month or so, but we've had some riots and mobs and people being brought in to protest, and we've had this stuff, and it's sad thing is it isn't just always the local people doing it, and so we've had this history for centuries of some people getting upset and bringing others in to riot and to cause all the commotion. And it's basically the same thing that happened when Jesus was crucified. The religious leaders stirred the crowd up. They got the mob mentality going, and that's what happened. And here too, maybe there were some ruffians in the marketplace. So some people maybe not of the best character, some people maybe who were not afraid to do something a little bit underhanded, but would do something for money. And anyway, they hired them, and they stirred up the crowd, and they were searching for Paul and Silas to bring them before the magistrates, the leaders, and they couldn't find Paul and Silas. So they attacked, it says, the house of Jason, the house where Paul and Silas and several of the other believers were staying. And they didn't find Paul and Silas there, so they took Jason and some of the other believers there before the magistrates and said, these people are housing and helping stir up the crowds against the emperor, and they're doing all this, and we demand justice. We demand that you do something with them. So they were somewhat arrested, but Luke tells us that they paid bail and they were let out on bail. So they weren't held in jail that way. But, the words of the mob was, these people have been turning the world upside down. Other places, and they have come here also. They're trying to change things and trying to do something that we just don't really like too well. Anyway, but so out of concerned for the safety of Paul and Silas, the believers here in Thessalonica urged them to leave, and they helped them get out of the city at night. And they traveled through a couple of communities, and they got to Berea. And when they arrived there, they went to a Jewish synagogue. Here again, another large enough city. And while they were there, they found a little bit better welcome from the Jews and from the Greeks as well. And many of the Jews and the Greeks living there, both men and women and it says of high standing, were believing and accepting and hearing the word of Jesus as Messiah. However, people up in Thessalonica heard about this, so what did they do? They got those ruffians and they sent them down there and stirred up, and they said, these people have caused trouble in Thessaly in our city, and now they come in here. So the rioters followed Paul and Silas to try to stop the spread of the message. And so when this started happening, then Paul left the city. Silas and Timothy remained there for a little while, but those who took Paul away took him as far as Athens. And when Paul was there in Athens, he sent word back to Silas and Timothy to come join him there. And while Paul was there, he was wandering around in the city, and he was noticing temples and shrines and idols on just about every street corner, just all over the place. And if you know your Greek mythology, they had a lot of gods and goddesses and sub-gods, and there was hardly an end to the gods and goddesses that they worshipped and had temples to and were promoting to the people as to, this is the God you need to pray for this, and this is the God you need to pray for that, and this is the God, da-da-da-da-da-da. But Paul noticed all of these temples. He noticed all of these idols. And as he was debating, arguing with the people here in Athens, again, in a Jewish synagogue, so here's three large enough cities, Thessalonica, Berea, and Athens, that had Jewish temple synagogues, but Paul was, again, teaching about Jesus there. And some of the, not only the Jewish members of the community were talking with Paul, but also some of it says the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were debating with Paul, and were having conversation with Paul about God. And so these others, the Epicureans and the Stoics, would be the Greeks who were believing and promoting, let's say, the other gods, the Greek gods. But they were listening to Paul. But some of them said, what is this guy babbling about? He just goes on and on and on and on. He's babbling about something. What is it? Well, Paul gets in front of the whole crowd at the Areopagus, and this is where he starts. Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are, for you in every way. For as I went throughout the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them even an altar with the inscription, to an unknown God. So you're not only worshiping all of the gods that you know by name, Zeus and Poseidon and la-di-da, all of those, but you have a shrine to an unknown God. Let me introduce you to this unknown God. Let me tell you and show you about the God of the Hebrews, about the God of the Israel, about the God who sent his son Jesus into the world. Let me educate you about this unknown God so that you may know the one true God. It's just, he stumbles upon this altar that is, to an unknown God. And he understands that, they don't really know what they're worshiping or who they're worshiping or how they should worship or any of those things. But he says, I came upon this one to an inscription, to an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, I proclaim to you. This is the God who made the world and everything in it. He is the Lord of heaven and earth, and he does not live in temples made by human hands. And Paul is remembering, God told David and God told Moses, no, you're not going to build a temple to me. You worship me in this, they had the tent and they worshiped him outdoors. And it wasn't until Solomon that finally there was a temple built. And that temple was destroyed several times. And again, shortly, in AD 70, the temple in Jerusalem was again destroyed. So, Paul is saying that God doesn't live in these temples that you have created. God lives in your heart. God lives in your mind. God lives in you. He is as close as your breath, and he's not served by human hands as if he needs something from us. No, he gives us and all mortals breath in all things. And he goes on and he talks about, from one offspring, Adam. And then he says in verse 28, for we too are his offspring, And since we are God's offspring, he says in verse 29, we ought not to think that deities like gold or silver or stone or an image formed by art. No. Deity, God, isn't a picture. God isn't a statue. God isn't a stone. God isn't a building. God is the living essence that gives us everything. And so this is, God has overlooked human ignorance and all that. And he goes on to teach and to proclaim God, the Father, the creator of heaven and earth, and then to proclaim Jesus Christ. And the last thing we read in chapter 17 is that Paul left them then, but many joined him and became believers. And then he mentions two, Dionysus and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So Paul seizes an opportunity. He sees an inscription on an altar to an unknown God and proceeds to let them know who God really is. Who God really is. And sisters and brothers, I rejoice that we worship this living God and pray that he will bless you richly today as always.